My name is Stephanie and I'm with Agriculture for Life, and today we're going to be cooking carrot soup and we're going to be making biscuits to go with the soup. Before we get started, I'm going to get everyone to preheat your oven. So we will need, for the biscuits, the oven will have to be preheated to 475 degrees. So if you want to go ahead and preheat it, we'll get started. Okay, so if everyone's ovens are on 475 degrees, we'll get going through some housekeeping items. First of all, a few kitchen safety things. You want no loose clothing on, so everyone looks to be good. Nobody has loose clothing. Make sure your hair is tied back. You don't want your hair getting in the way while you're cooking. You don't want it getting in your food. And a couple things we'll have to be careful of. We'll have to be careful of the ovens while we're cooking, and then we will be using knives, so we'll make sure we go over knife safety before we do that. Before we get started, if you haven't yet, wash your hands. I'm gonna wash my hands right now, and then we can come back and we can start cooking the recipes. So, carrot soup and biscuits. First thing you want to do before you're cooking is orient yourself to your kitchen. So know where everything is, know where all your ingredients are, all your utensils are, and make sure everything's in front of you. And if you don't have it in front of you, don't worry, we'll be going through it as we read through the recipes. And remember, one thing about cooking or baking is if you have a certain time that you need to do something for, it's more important to go by what you see, what you hear, and what you smell, because those are going to be better than any time that's in the recipe. In a large pot, heat the butter over medium heat, and once the butter has melted, we'll add the onions and salt. So let's start with the butter. So I have my stove in front of me here, and I have a pot. We need a 1/4 cup of butter. And if you have a stick of butter like this, they usually have measurements along the side. And so mine has a cup measurement, a 1/4 cup, and a 1/2 cup. And since we only need a 1/4 of a cup, we're just going to cut right along where it says a 1/4. And then I'm just going to peel the outside off. And this can go right in our pot. And I'm just going to turn my stove on here. So if you haven't yet, I would take the time now to turn your stove on. And I'm going to put a lid on top of mine just to make the butter melt faster. Again, if you don't have a lid, that's okay too. It will still melt. But while the butter is melting, we're going to add the onion and the salt. So we need 1 cup of yellow onions chopped. Onions in soup are aromatics, which means that they give the soup a lot of flavor. So it's not too important how you cut it. And I'll give you a couple tips for cutting. You want your one hand to be in a claw, so that's the hand that's holding the food and it will stay out of the way, and then the other hand to be chopping. And we're going to peel the outside of the onion off. And then for those of you that are following along with me, you can just slice the onion. We don't need it cut up too small, because like I said, we're going to be blending this all in the end, so it doesn't really matter how we cut it. And remembering to keep your hand that's not chopping out of the way. And then I'm going to go ahead and chop mine all the other direction. Go ahead and put it in the pot with the butter. And we're going to need 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And this will just help add a little bit of flavor. So if you want to grab your 1/2 teaspoon, and if you don't know how to tell which one is a teaspoon, you can read right on it, TSP means teaspoon. And so I have 1 here and 1/2, and I'm going to use the 1/2. And to differentiate that from a tablespoon is TBSP. So grab your 1/2 teaspoon. And this can just go right in the pot with the onion. And then once you've added the salt, I would give it a quick stir. Mix everything up together. Next we need garlic. So if you haven't grabbed your garlic yet, I'd grab it right now, and we're going to use 3 cloves. So mine are in a bunch like this right now, and I'm going to kind of peel back a little bit and grab 3 cloves. I'm going to put my knife on it and press it flat, and that will make it a little bit easier to peel the outside off. And then the outside will come right off. And we're going to do that 2 more times to the next 2 cloves of garlic. Pushing on it, then peeling the outside off. If your onions are cooking, it's important to remember to give them a stir so nothing burns to the bottom. And like I said, onions are an aromatic, so as they're cooking, you're going to smell a lot of very good smells. So I have 3 cloves of garlic here, all without the outside on. I'm just going to chop them up, again, keeping your one hand out of the way, so using a claw to cut them. You can just cut it into little pieces. These, like I said earlier, it's all going to be blended up in the end, so it's okay if your pieces are not all the same size. You're just going to add a lot of flavor to the soup. And the point of aromatics like this is not to take away from the taste of the carrots, but to add to the taste of the carrots. And go ahead and add your garlic in, and then give it all a good stir. And if you want, I would suggest putting the lid on and just letting that sit for a few minutes, and we're going to get the next ingredient ready. Next, we're going to add the carrots and cook until they've softened, stirring occasionally. We need 2 cups of carrots. And I have 2 carrots about this size, and that's probably going to be about a cup, but we'll chop them up, we'll measure, and then if we need to adjust, we'll adjust as necessary. For cutting the carrots, we're going to cut them into about coin-sized pieces. All right, and if everyone's ready with their carrots, we'll start chopping them, blending it all in the end. So it's not too important that they're teeny. Keeping my one hand out of the way. And so I'm going to go ahead and add them. Also, this is a good reminder to stir everything. We don't want anything to burn. And if you haven't yet, add your carrots now. And then give them a good stir. And we're going to keep the carrots in there until they're softened, so that's going to take a little bit of time. And while we're waiting for them to soften, we'll start making biscuits. In a large bowl, whisk together flour, baking powder, sugar, and salt. And also, this is a good reminder to keep your workspace clean. So if you do have things in front of you, I'd put them off to the side. I wouldn't worry about washing your dishes right away, but making sure that everything is at least kind of out of your way. So when you're measuring out your flour, I would suggest to stick your measuring spoon in. So we're using 1 cup. Scoop it and then level it off with your finger. And the reason you do that is because we're not packing it in when we're baking, but we're just leveling it. And most mistakes are made with baking when things aren't measured properly. So we're going to do our best to measure as accurately as we can. All right, level it off with your finger. Whoop. You might get flour everywhere. Okay, I got 1 cup. Two cups of flour. Also, I'll just note that a tricky part of making 2 recipes is that we have 2 things on the go. So I'm going to continue to check on my carrots and just give them a stir, making sure that nothing's burning. If it's cooking too quickly, if it sounds like it's boiling too much, you might want to turn it down. I'm going to turn mine down just a little bit. All right, 2 teaspoons of baking powder. So grab your teaspoon and your baking powder. Like I said earlier, the way you can know it's a teaspoon, it will say TSP, and that stands for teaspoon. You can just stick it right in there and measure it out. 1 teaspoon and 2 teaspoons. Then we also need 2 teaspoons of sugar. And sugar is nice in biscuits because it adds a little bit of sweetness. We're not necessarily making something super sweet, but we just want to add, because it has more of a savory taste, but we'll add a little bit of, just a little bit of sweetness. So 1 teaspoon and 2 teaspoons. And then lastly, for the dry ingredients, we need 1 teaspoon of salt. Okay. Now I'm going to take a measuring utensil, or a mixing utensil, and just mix it all together. So don't worry about mixing it too much, but it's good to give it a good stir, just to combine everything together. Just a quick stir. And again, I'm just going to check on my carrots to make sure they're still cooking. Okay, let's see how much butter we need. We need 1/2 cup of unsalted butter. So I'm going to use the same butter that I used before. And again, if you look at it, there's little measurements all along the side. And 1/2 cup is about that much. It's not very much. I'm just going to cut it right there. And if you were in the scone baking class last week, you'll know this about the butter, but when we put it into the biscuits, it's very similar to scones. We want it to be cold. So my butter's been sitting out for a little bit. It's a little bit warmer, so it's going to be a little bit harder to cut up. But we're going to do our best, and we'll be pinching it with our fingers anyways. So it's not a huge deal if it's a little warm. So we're just going to take it and cut it into cubes. However that may look, so you might cut it one way and then cut it in the other direction to make it a cube. And to do this, you don't have to use a very sharp knife because the butter's soft already. You can even just use a butter knife. I'm going to take it and add it right to the flour mixture. So I just added my butter to the flour. You can put it right in there. And then, so the third direction on our biscuit says cut the butter into cubes and add it to the mixture. You can combine it with a pastry cutter, 2 forks, or with your fingers, and the mixture should be crumbly and have pea-sized chunks. And the reason for that is because we don't want it to be too small, we don't want it to be too big. We want little pockets of butter within the biscuits. It's going to make them light, it's going to give them a lot of flavor, and it's just going to be what makes the biscuits so good. And when you're mixing it with your hands, I would err on the side of having the chunks of butter to be a little bit bigger rather than smaller, because you can always go back and make them smaller, but once they're small, you can't make them bigger. So just crumbling it up with your hands. You can feel the butter. It's getting quite soft already. It doesn't take very much. Breaking it up into little chunks. But the next step is going to be to add the milk and mix the dough until it's soft and pulls away from the side. We're adding 1 cup of whole milk. And because we were just mixing with our hands, I'm going to wash my hands quickly and then I'll grab my measuring cup. Go ahead and grab your milk and your cup and just have it in front of you. Also, I would take this time just to make sure your carrots are still cooking. Add the milk and mix until the dough is soft. We're going to add 1 cup of milk. And there we go. So if you've added your milk, I'm just going to give us a little heads up of our next step. The next step that we're going to be doing is using our hands to mix it together, and then we're going to be putting it onto the counter. So we'll have to flour the counter first. So before we put our hands in here, just because our hands are going to be covered in flour, I would suggest grabbing your flour and we'll flour the counter. Instead of sprinkling it right from the top, if you actually flick from the side, it allows it to more evenly disperse the flour amongst the counter. And I'm just going to wipe the extra flour off. I'm going to start with a mixing utensil, and then I always find it easiest if you just use your hands. So you can put your hands right in there and start bringing the dough together. And you might find at first that your dough is quite wet, but as we mix together, it should become more dry, and if not, we can always adjust the ingredients as we go. I'm just going to dump it onto the counter. It doesn't have to be perfect right now. It kind of just might be in a big clump. Mine's kind of in a big clump. It's not a perfect ball. And I'm just going to start working it together with my hands. And right now I'm finding that my dough is pretty sticky, so I might actually add a little bit more flour. I'm going to kind of sprinkle it right on top and all over. Okay, and kind of just work your dough so that it comes together. Just like with the scones last week, we don't want to overwork our dough because we don't want the butter to melt. And then once it's kind of in a circle, bring it together and just start to press it down with your palm. And sometimes recipes at this point will call for a rolling pin. I'm just going to use my hands. That's what I've used before, and it seems to work for me. But that's the nice thing about baking. You can kind of just do what works best for you. And we're working the dough and pressing it flat till about 1/2 inch thick. And I'm just pushing it down with my hands. Yeah, it looks good. Looks very good. Okay, and the next step, cut with a biscuit cutter, cookie cutter, or the top of a glass and place on a prepared baking sheet. I have my prepared baking sheet right behind me. I'm going to bring it over so that I can easily access it, so that I don't have to carry the dough from one spot to another. And then you can use any of those 3 things that I listed. I'm going to be using a glass just because I find it easiest. And you will want to lightly flour the rim of your glass just because your dough, biscuits are a little bit stickier and we don't want it sticking to the glass. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pressing it right onto the dough. You don't want to twist, because if you twist, you might compress those pockets of butter that we have in the dough. So just put on and press right down. And I'm going to start by doing mine along the edges and then in the middle. I'm going to try to get as many biscuits out of this as I can. And then once I have all my circles cut out, I'm going to work the dough again into a ball, press it flat, and then I'll continue making my biscuits. And as I'm pressing it down, I'm bringing my biscuits over to my pan. And I'm going to lay them on the baking sheet about 1 inch apart, but it's okay if they're a little bit further apart or even a little bit closer. These will grow a little bit, but not too much. And I'm bringing my dough again together into a ball because I couldn't get any more circles out of it. I'm going to just bring it with my hands, press it flat again. And with my last bit of dough, I don't really think I have enough to press my cup into, so I'm actually just I rolled it into a ball, then I just flattened it with my palms, and this one isn't going to be a perfect biscuit, like the rest of them are all about the same size, about the same shape. This one's not going to be, but it's just going to taste just as great, so that is totally fine. Okay, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I made 10 biscuits, and yours might not be as much, it might be more, depending on the size of whatever you use to cut your biscuits out with. Let's look at the next step. Step number 7, bake for 10 to 12 minutes until the tops are golden brown. So I'm going to pop mine into the oven, and just remember what I said at the beginning about the time that it gives you. Your eyes and your nose for this one are going to be a better indicator of its doneness than the time. So when the tops turn golden brown, when we press them and they spring back, that means they're good. So I'm putting mine in my oven, and make sure to do so carefully because your oven's going to be hot. All right, once everyone has theirs in their oven, we'll move on to the next step. And while we're waiting, I'm just going to take this second to clear off my workspace because I have flour everywhere. And I'm sure everyone else does too. Okay, I'm going to give my carrots a stir. This is definitely going to be ready for the broth, which is the next step. And I have this size container of vegetable broth, which I've found is good enough for 4 cups, which is exactly what we need for this recipe. I'm going to open my broth, and we're measuring out 4 cups and pouring it right in there. And once your broth is in there, we're going to check on your biscuits. Like I said earlier, the tops should be starting to turn golden. If you feel safe doing this, you can take a finger and poke it into the top and it should spring back up. I'm gonna leave mine, the tops aren't quite golden yet. They don't look too baked. I am gonna check on my soup, however, because this is boiling a lot, so I'm gonna turn mine down. And then make sure to give your soup a stir. So again, because we softened our carrots for quite a while earlier, we probably don't need to boil this for quite as long. I'm actually just gonna turn my element off here. And I'm gonna give it a few minutes to cool down. And while that's cooling, I'm gonna grab the other ingredients that I'm gonna need after. So that's cream and pepper. And the cream is gonna make it thick and creamy, and the pepper is just gonna give it a little bit of spice to taste. I'm gonna grab those two things and just have them ready beside me. And then I'm also going to get my immersion blender ready while I do that. And since mine's pretty hot, I'm actually gonna take it off the burner. My biscuits are looking golden brown on the top. I'm actually gonna go ahead and take them out and I can show you what they look like. Okay, so this might be a little hard to see. If you wanna take a look, the very tops of mine are starting to turn golden brown. And mine are all done, and I'm just gonna place them on the oven. Now, if anybody's using an immersion blender, you're gonna have to be very careful at this step, just because this could really make it spray everywhere. So I would suggest when you're putting it in to make sure it's fully immersed into the soup. If it's half in, half out, it's going to be spraying everywhere. And start just by giving the blender a light tap to make sure it's not spraying. And you can also do this while your soup is still hot, just being extra cautious not to burn yourself, but your blender will be okay. And now this part is really up to you. So like I said earlier, if you want more chunks in your soup, it might be good to go now. I personally like when my soup is a little bit thicker, so I blend it a little bit more just to get all those chunks of carrots nicely blended up. Next, we're gonna stir in the heavy cream and pepper. Again, the cream is to add creaminess and the pepper adds some spice. We are gonna need half a cup of heavy cream. I've got my cream here, and I've got my half a cup measuring utensil. I'm just gonna pour the cream in. I'm gonna put those both off to the side. And I'm gonna give it a stir now. And when you're at this step, you'll notice that the soup gets a little bit lighter, and that's gonna make it thick and creamy. And the fat in the cream is gonna add a lot of flavor to this. And then pepper. The recipe just called for pepper to taste. And so that really leaves it up to you to add as much or as little as you want. Usually, I'd add about a pinch. I'm just gonna pour a sprinkle in mine. If you want more spice, add a little more. And just go ahead and mix it right in. All right, well, if your biscuits are out of the oven and your soup's all blended, that's all we have for today. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We will be having more cooking classes, so you can visit our website, which is agricultureforlife.ca, and that's all we have for today. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and hopefully we'll see you next time.